Hi, Seare, Lia, and Suren. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's symposium conversation. Seare wrote a new piece called Arrival for solo piano based on Lia's photograph, Hello Darkness, My Old Friend. And this conversation is slightly different because this is in process. This is the first draft of the piece. The final will be released in mid-June. So we really get to discuss what that process is like and experience that. So that's really exciting for us. Thank you all for being here. And I wanted to start by asking Lia, if you could speak a little bit about your motivations for submitting Hello Darkness, My Old Friend to the symposium.
Okay, hi, and thank you for choosing the work and inviting me to the conversation. So Hello Darkness, My Old Friend is a photograph that I took about a month or so prior to the November election. And I felt a little anxious about the results, and I tend to take objects and that I find that have a prior history, a patina of time, as I like to say. And so I take them in the studio, and sometimes they sit around for a little while, and then I find them and I play with them. I create compositions, and particularly because of COVID, everything had to be in the studio at home. So I create compositions, and it's a kind of iterative process for me. This particular piece is created out of an old tattered baseball that my spouse found on the street one day. When I went in the studio that night, I saw it, and it spoke to me, and I decided to work with it that particular night, and I created a kind of a composition with a particular lighting style, and created the sort of global universal view, which helped me calm down a little bit that night, because as I said, I felt a little anxious about where things were going. And that piece, it's part of what I like to do. It sort of creates a new meaning from old, discarded, mundane objects that are found on the street or in the woods or someplace. And so that's really what my aim is. I try to change, or at least attempt to change the meaning of the object that I find. And for me, in that particular piece that night, it allowed me to see things from a larger, more global, more universal perspective. And I hope that's what I did with the piece.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And that's a perfect way to lead into Seare. So what inspired you and drew you to Hello Darkness, My Old Friend? And can you speak a little bit about the act of being in process of creating music based on the photograph?
Yeah, I actually think it's so serendipitous that I was immediately drawn to Leah's photograph, because our processes are pretty similar. We take objects, and in my case, it might be like a melody or a musical motive. In hers, and mundane, or like just like an everyday object that is transformed by her photography. And so what I was originally drawn to when I first saw the photograph was the motion that existed in it. It's a still two-dimensional thing in reality, like as the way we're perceiving it. But when I first saw it, immediately I felt this gravity, like that it's like this has this potential energy. But then you look at it a little longer, and it starts to grow limbs, and it's this like alien-like creature that's crawling. So it took on these many, many faces. And at the same time, I'm like this tiny little figure that's like kind of cowering from it because of its like countenance in the photograph. And so in a similar way, I also, my process when composing is to take a just improvise until I find these like little musical motives, harmonies, and melodies that I just play around with until I enjoy. And then I go back to the drawing board and use mathematical processes, break it apart, completely abstract it from its identifiable characteristics, and then try to reconstruct that same feeling that the melodies first gave me, but through this kind of like um, puzzle like pattern. So like I take these little puzzle pieces that were drawn from mathematical processes. In this case, I split up the melodies in these like asymmetrical ways. They all, to me, feel like the little strings that are wound around the baseball that is the subject of this photograph, and slowly come together to form this object that kind of floats and hangs out. And so that's where Arrival started.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's so interesting to hear how you're both kind of aligned in your processes, um, and how that is coming through in this collaboration. Seare, do you mind expanding a little bit on where you are right now in the composition process and talking a little bit about that?
Totally. So right now, I I have fleshed out beginnings of ideas. So I have the start of the introduction, like it's kind of like a fugal texture where each voice individually enters. I have little moments of stillness, suspended harmonies, and so I have these concrete places I want to go, pillars, if you will. And what I need to get to is how to bridge those pillars together to create the whole image. So like kind of the way I'm viewing it in terms of the photograph is like I have what it feels like when I'm staring straight into the face of this object, or I have what it feels like that moment when it grows limbs, or the feeling of it falling down, suspended in its dimension. But I don't have the way to kind of like rotate the camera around the object yet. So yeah, that's about where I am.
And Suren, I just heard the audio of the recording and it's so brilliantly played. Uh, and I'm just so glad to have you on this project. So how is it for you as the performer of the piece to kind of go through the process of bringing a new piece into the world with Seare and with this photograph in mind? What has that been like for you? Oh, sorry, Suren, you're muted.
Classic Zoom error. Sorry, I'm looking at the carpet behind me, and now all those little sideways figures remind me of the central piece in the photograph. I've just never seen it that way before. Yeah, so the nice thing about working with living composers, which I mean, the vast majority of what I do as a pianist is playing the music of composers past, is that we can get real feedback, and we can actually. I think what's more important than, or rather, I think what's most important is knowing what some of the motivations were, understanding this sound world that the composer was going for, and in this case, also understanding what the source of inspiration meant to Seare as well, because I had a reaction to the image, Seare had a reaction to the image, and it's interesting to see how those two meet. Not that it would be in any way problematic if there was no meeting of the two reactions. I think that would also be very interesting. But in this case, I think there was. And one thing I find personally very fascinating about this specific collaboration, or rather just the notion of pairing music with artwork and having one be inspired by the other, is that in many ways, I think that musicians, performers, composers struggle with this idea of creating a score, which is a sort of a static product, and reconciling that with the fact that music is a dynamic unfolding process. And so I think that's there's sort of static architecture of imagining the score in your head as this construct that you can rotate. You know, Seare specifically mentioned this idea of like, I don't yet have I can't rotate the camera around the object yet, but that implies that there's this fixed object in one's mind. But the second that you start playing it, it's not like a house anymore. It's like a house in the process of being built, or you're being led through a place. And so I find that really fascinating to explore, because it also makes me look at the artwork in a different light as well, as an unfolding process that sort of in reverse becomes inspired by the piece that it itself inspired, at least in my mind. In terms of my approach to this sort of stuff, as with like a lot of contemporary music, I think the first stage is just, you got to like beat it into your head, because they're just some of the most obvious patterns won't necessarily reveal themselves to you until you let teach your body to hear the piece. That's also a really fascinating thing that ends up happening. Like, you can't really grasp what's going on, but your hands have ears. Not quite literally, but in your brain, it's quite literal. Like, there are connections that are made between what you hear and what you feel. Anybody who like improvises or who composes, you come up with different ideas at the table composing than you would at the keyboard if you're a keyboardist, or at the violin if you're a violinist, right? It sparks different neural networks. So I guess the first stage is sort of teaching your body to hear the piece, and desperately looking for patterns to make your life easier. And yeah, eventually it starts coming together in a really fascinating way. Things that were unfamiliar become familiar. And yeah, there are definitely some clear motives in this piece. There are some sections where I think they're immediately audible. It doesn't take too much rooting around for them. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell. It starts with just a lot of sort of brute force button pushing, just getting it into the brain, and then bit by bit that becomes a slightly warmer and more inviting process. Yeah.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about that, and I love the way you articulate that process. And I'm wondering how that relates to you in this process of having these sort of pillars that Seare has provided at this stage in the composition's life, and how you're able to kind of marinate into the piece as it's being built. So as opposed to having the full score, the final draft just presented to yourself and like just learning it, what it's like to have just, the bones of the piece, and then slowly over the next few months, having that being filled out, and your body, I guess, also getting used to the piece as a whole by way of these pillars.
Right. Well, it's a nice on-ramp. Like, I'm not just presented with this massive chunk of something that I need to absorb really quickly. So it's nice to be introduced gently to what are some pretty challenging ideas. And yeah, I'm fascinated to see. I don't know if it's just me but I feel this as a performer. And Audrey, I've seen you play. I saw on I remember I was watching this online thing, and you were part of this Fortepiano Valley of the Moon festival. And I wonder if as a performer you feel the same way, where some of the most difficult parts to interpret are connecting passages. And I feel that it's not that they're just difficult to interpret, they're also difficult to write. Like, once you set something in motion, it's almost like uniformity is easy to process. You have an idea. Writing a fugal entry with all the voices, that's kind of easy. It's writing the episodes, the transitions between those sections, that is really very challenging, because it involves more creative decision making. It's not as process driven. So as a performer, I find it difficult to manage interpretive considerations in transitional passages. The little composition improvising I've done, it's always like, oh, I'm so great at this. I have this melodic idea, and then getting to the next melodic idea, I just kind of bash my hands against the keyboard and hope for the best. So yeah, I guess this is the early stages where I get to not contend with transitional passages, and I wonder if Seare might feel the same, where yeah, the transitional passages are more daunting to write than the not transitional passages.
Yeah, if I could just, it's definitely, I definitely agree. It's when you start something in motion, when you get a ball rolling, when do you tell the ball to stop? Like, when do you turn that corner? And how do you make that, like, when you turn the corner, like, if I have like some kind of thing that's happening, if you make it sudden and interject and go in a different direction, that's a choice. Like you said, all these transitions are creative choices. And so at that point, it's like, what is the narrative that you're trying to convey and provide? And I definitely think it's very much a compositional choice, but seeing it as a performance, an interpretive choice as well is really interesting. And I've never really thought about it that way as well.
And I think this is an interesting way to bring Lia in. I'm sorry, this conversation has become so musical jargony. But I'm wondering, in your process of taking a photograph or capturing Hello Darkness, My Old Friend, the process of being behind the camera or rotating in the way that Seare is describing and as a transitional passage between different melodic ideas, if anything here resonates for you or aligns with your process as an artist.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm not a musical person. I'm a visual person. And I'm fascinated by the conversation as it relates to the iterative process that the composer as well as the performer uses to interpret the piece, because that's exactly how the visual image that I create works as well. I add, I subtract, I change the lighting, I change the angle, I change the perspective, so that in the end it sort of works. It sort of, it clicks something in your brain, you go, okay, that's it. And sometimes it takes hundreds of images of the same thing to, as Seare was saying, just move the camera around a little bit, or usually I move the piece around a little bit so that finally the lighting, the angle, the scale, everything seems to work in the image. And so that I find that fascinating. I hadn't expected that, actually. And I see a real, what's the word for it? Resonance in how these things work together. And the other thought I had was, as you were talking, the ball seems to the tendrils of the ball seems to ever so slightly rest on it's actually plexiglass, but on the bottom, on the platform, on the bottom, and then it gets reflected back. And that's exactly what I tried to achieve in the photograph, where I just wanted the weight of the world just ever so slightly rest on the bottom of the piece, and it balances. And that with the sort of longer, more global view, knowing that everything was going to be fine in the end, that kind of feeling I wanted to convey. And so here we have the simple tattered, the inside of the baseball just taking on an entirely new meaning as the tendrils just very, very softly rest and balance. And it feels like you can't really do that because the thing is so heavy, but yet it still manages to do that. So the lightness of the tendrils and the weight of the ball itself all seem to be in balance in the end. So that I hear in the process of Seare as well. How, and then also how the interpretation sort of goes from one pillar, and then the connection of the tendrils to the next pillar, perhaps.
Well, this conversation has been really wonderful, and I'm so thrilled to have the three of you working together collaboratively in this sort of process of releasing this draft stage and then having a full piece, a completed composition released in mid-June. So thank you all for being part of this. And one of the things that jumps out for me, just hearing Suren, you talk about the performance process, and I think this is because I'm also a performer, so I relate most intimately to that role, is I'm wondering if, like, you know, if there was a way for performers or of any instrument to be presented with really difficult pieces in a way where you get the 5 pillars first, and then you get the transitions later, and how that might change the process. And
Yeah.
thinking about that could inform a lot about performance practice and compositional practice visually and musically. So this is really enlightening. And yeah, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.